In the early 1930s, a dark cloud loomed over Ukraine. It was a time of great suffering, as the leadership of the Soviet Union, under the iron grip of Joseph Stalin, orchestrated a sinister plot that would forever scar the Ukrainian nation. This was the Holodomor, a genocide that unfolded in the years 1932 to 1933. The true motive behind this tragedy was a chilling one. The Soviet regime sought to suppress the spirit of the Ukrainian people, to crush their aspirations for independence and nationhood. It was an era marked by fierce resistance to the regime's stranglehold, as Ukrainians yearned for the freedom to chart their own destiny. In 2006, Ukraine took a monumental step by officially recognizing the Holodomor as a genocide against its people. It was a solemn acknowledgement of the horrors that had befallen them. 4 years later, in 2010, the Court of Appeal in Kyiv affirmed the genocidal nature of the Holodomor. It laid bare the intentions of those responsible: Stalin, Molotov, Kaganovich, Postyshev, Chabar, Kartayevich, and Kozhor. Their aim had been nothing short of the destruction of a significant part of the Ukrainian nation. During those grim years of 1932 to 1933, millions of Ukrainians perished. They met their fate not only within the borders of the Ukrainian SSR but also in lands historically inhabited by Ukrainians: the Kuban, the North Caucasus, Lower Volga, and Kazakhstan. The Holodomor was a tragedy that knew no bounds. To truly understand the significance of the Holodomor, one must delve into the annals of Ukrainian history. In the 17th century, Ukraine found itself divided between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Moscow Kingdom. For centuries thereafter, the Ukrainian nation endured political oppression, cultural suppression, and a constant struggle for national identity. Despite the relentless Russification efforts and the policy of assimilation, Ukrainians clung to their distinct identity. They fiercely maintained their awareness of being a separate nation, one with a unique history and culture. The 20th century ushered in a brief period of independence for Ukraine. In 1918, the Ukrainian People's Republic was established, uniting Ukrainian territories. However, this newfound independence faced constant threats from external forces and struggled to build a solid foundation. Following the third occupation of Ukrainian lands, which were once part of the Russian Empire, the Russian Bolsheviks imposed their will upon Ukraine. On December 30, 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics came into being, incorporating the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. While the Union professed equality among its member states, it was clear that Ukraine was under the Kremlin's control. The story of the Holodomor is one of immense suffering, resilience, and the enduring spirit of a people who refused to be silenced. It serves as a stark reminder of the atrocities that can be inflicted when power goes unchecked. In the tapestry of Ukrainian history, one can trace deep-rooted traditions that stretch back to the days of Kiev and Rus. These traditions served as a unifying force, strengthening the spirit of Ukrainian nationalism. However, they clashed with the ideals of Leninist socialism, which aimed to merge nations under the banner of the Soviet Union. When the Russian Bolsheviks swept into Ukraine, they were acutely aware of the nation's deep-seated identity. Lenin himself viewed national sovereignty and movements as inherently bourgeois, something his regime actively sought to eradicate. The Ukrainian identity stood in stark opposition to the Soviet vision of the unified USSR. Under communist rule, significant changes were imposed upon Ukrainian society, particularly in rural areas. The Soviet authorities introduced new customs and rituals, all while pressuring people to renounce their heritage and roots. The policy of Ukrainization, which had been gaining momentum, was abruptly halted. This marked the beginning of an assault on the spiritual life of Ukrainians. In 1928, the Soviet leadership unveiled a policy of collectivization, forcing individual farmers to merge their private holdings into state-run collective farms. Farmers were paid based on the number of workdays they contributed, but these wages were often meager, barely enough to feed their families. Given the strong individualistic tendencies of Ukrainian farmers, this collectivization policy faced fierce resistance. The regime resorted to coercion, terror, and propaganda to compel villagers into joining collective farms. Those who dissented were labeled as kulaks, bourgeois nationalists, or counter-revolutionaries, and they faced dire consequences. The Ukrainian people, especially its farmers, resisted the Soviet policies vigorously. Historians have documented around 4,000 mass demonstrations by farmers in the early 1930s. These protests were a response to collectivization, exploitative tax policies, theft, and the brutality unleashed by the authorities. The sense of national identity among Ukrainian farmers, combined with their fierce individualism, posed a significant threat to the Soviet ideology and unity. This unique blend formed the basis of Ukrainian nationalism, which was seen as an existential challenge to the USSR. Recognizing the danger of uprisings, Stalin and his inner circle devised a horrifying plan. Disguised as grain procurement initiatives, it involved the complete seizure of grain stocks and the confiscation of property as penalties for failing to meet grain quotas. Ukraine was systematically cut off from any potential sources of aid. A cruel twist of fate saw around 22 million people trapped within the borders of the Holodomor, forbidden to travel to cities in Russia and Belarus. The Ukrainian heartland became a prison of famine. Stalin perceived the Ukrainian farmers as the backbone of the national movement, the guardians of Ukrainian traditions, culture, and language. In 1932, an impossible grain procurement target of 356 million poods of grain was set for Ukraine. To approve this plan, Stalin's closest allies, Kaganovich and Molotov, visited Kharkiv, fully aware of the extent of the famine that had already begun to grip Ukraine. The Holodomor, a man-made famine, was orchestrated and carried out through the legitimization of violence and mass murder by government representatives. Around 400 archival documents stand as solemn witnesses to this horrifying chapter in history. The Holodomor stands as a chilling testament to the consequences of unchecked power and the enduring strength of a people who refused to be silenced, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. As the early 1930s rolled in, collectivization in Ukraine was spiraling into chaos. Farmers were deserting their lands en masse, reclaiming their possessions, livestock, supplies, and the hard-earned grain. In a desperate bid to retain control over these farms and properties, the regime enacted a crushing resolution known among the people as the Law on 5 Ears of Grain. This resolution, crafted by the Second Council of People's Commissars of the USSR, was officially titled On Safekeeping Property of State Enterprises, Collective Farms and Cooperatives and Strengthening Public Property. It declared all collective property as state property, imposing severe penalties for theft. Under this law, famished farmers who dared to collect leftover crops from fields could face a decade of imprisonment, loss of property, or even execution. This starkly robbed people of their right to access any food. The resolution also authorized a designated group of individuals to conduct searches within the population to forcibly confiscate grain. These searches were marked by terror, as well as physical and psychological abuse. Another grim measure in this genocidal campaign was the introduction of food fines. This gave the state the power to seize not just grain, but any food or property that could be bartered for sustenance. Such extreme measures were unparalleled in any other Soviet republic. To exacerbate the famine in Ukraine, on November 18, 1932, the Politburo of the CCP, driven by Molotov's insistence, enforced a terrifying regime known as the Black Boards. This involved the complete food blockade of farms, villages, and districts. It meant the total confiscation of food, the prohibition of trade and transport, and the prevention of residents from leaving, enforced by military units, the GPU, and the police. This ruthless regime was only imposed in Ukraine and Kuban, regions inhabited by Ukrainians. The Kremlin had created conditions designed to annihilate the Ukrainian nation by depriving them of all sustenance. A resolution from the CP and the People's Commissars of the USSR on January 22, 1933, signed by Stalin and Molotov, imprisoned Ukrainians within the famine-stricken territory. It forbade them from leaving the Ukrainian SSR and Kuban to purchase any bread. No other administrative region of the USSR faced such harsh measures. The Stalinist regime vehemently denied the existence of famine in Ukraine. This denial led to the rejection of aid offered by numerous NGOs, including foreign Ukrainian communities and the International Red Cross. The suffering of the Ukrainian people was hidden behind a shroud of silence, while the world remained oblivious to their plight. In the spring of 1933, Ukraine was plunged into a catastrophic crisis. June marked the zenith of the Holodomor's horror. Every single day, An unfathomable 28,000 souls were claimed by the relentless grip of death. It was as if, with each passing hour, 1,168 lives were extinguished, and every minute, the world lost another 20 people. This was a time when Moscow grudgingly sent Ukraine seeds for sowing and food loans. However, when provisions did reach the villages, they were primarily provided as communal meals and solely to those collective farmers who were still able to work and endure the grueling conditions of the fields. All this unfolded against the backdrop of ample grain stocks, locked away in centralized state reserves, and extensive food exports. The actions of the totalitarian regime undeniably underscored its chilling intent, the obliteration of a portion of the Ukrainian nation, and all within a specified timeframe. In the commission of this heinous genocide during 1932 to 1933, the communist totalitarian regime ruthlessly exterminated millions of Ukrainians. However, certain historical circumstances have rendered calculations and the identification of victims exceedingly complex. The regime went to great lengths to conceal the aftermath of its crime. Recording the true number of deaths was strictly forbidden. Today, concealed lists have emerged from select village councils, cataloguing those who perished during 1932 to 1933. These lists exceed the official figures twofold. It's clear that such instances were not isolated. The cause of death was forbidden to be recorded as hunger. Death certificates were instead marked with vague explanations such as from typhus, exhaustion, or even old age. In 1934, all records pertaining to death registrations were handed over to a specific department of the GPU. Ukrainians perished in families and villages, and records were not always maintained. The extent of unreported deaths remains a mystery, but it's undeniable that millions perished in the shadows. The Soviet Union, through propaganda and bribes to select journalists, succeeded in convincing the international community to look the other way regarding the mass murder of Ukrainians. Yet, there were fearless truth-seekers among the publicists who dared to speak the truth. Reports from ambassadors and diplomats were meticulously preserved. The regime made concerted efforts to erase the memory of the millions of Ukrainian lives lost. However, the memory of a people is unbreakable. Moreover, with Ukraine's newfound independence, the prohibition on discussing the Holodomor was finally lifted.